Okay. So, Amanda, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and kind of give a rundown of what your position is?
Sure. My name is Amanda Patel. I am the Director for Medication Safety, Quality, and Accreditation for Providence Health Systems. Um, I was, I'm new to this position. It's a brand new job with the system. So my training is as a pharmacist. I did go to the University of Montana, graduated there from 2001, which seems like crazy that it's been that long. I feel like I just graduated last year. So by training, I am a pharmacist, but now I'm more focused on the medication safety and system sciences and safety sciences as well.
Okay. So, for folks who maybe not aren't as familiar with like that terminology, like how would you like everyday language kind of break that down?
Medication safety is kind of a newer role in pharmacy and in healthcare in general. It's something that we're kind of late to the game in healthcare. Medication safety is more focused on we get the reports of medication errors or adverse drug events that happen to patients in a hospital setting typically. And then the medication safety officer actually takes the report that comes in from the frontline staff and investigates to try to figure out what happened. So it could be you're looking at reports. It could be that you're looking at an electronic medical record to try to figure out if there was something wrong with the ordering of a particular medication. You may have to interview staff to try to find out what was going on at the time when the error occurred, try to get their feedback. And ultimately what you're trying to do is find the root cause for what happened for that particular medication error, and then try to put something into the system to make sure that it doesn't happen again to another patient.
Wow. So, I just quickly want to ask aside about this. Like, you're obviously talking about reasons for adverse drug events happening. How often is that human error, and how often is that possibly like a undiagnosed like genetic mutation? Like, what's that proportionality?
That's a really good question. I don't know if there's really good statistics out there. Unfortunately, one of the biggest problems with a position like this and looking at medication safety globally is events are incredibly underreported.
Mm.
So when we're looking at particularly medication safety events that occur, medication errors, they say in the literature that you're probably only getting 5 to 10% of the events that are actually occurring are being reported to you.
Wow.
And even probably less for adverse drug reactions. So it's really hard to get staff to take the time to sit down and put reports in. So then you're not getting really reliable data for how often these kind of events are occurring. So it's kind of hard to tease out exactly if it's because did somebody have an adverse drug event because of an error, or was it just typically, I mean, just because they had some sort of mutation or some kind of idiosyncratic reaction to a medication. So
Wow.
unfortunately, not good data out there on that.
Yeah, but that's just kind of interesting. Just when you're pulling apart a problem like this.
Yeah.
Okay, so you kind of gave us a little bit of rundown about your background, but let's just kind of dive back into your history. So did you go to the University of Montana as an undergrad?
I did not. I actually started out as a music major at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington. I was there on an oboe scholarship. Um, got about a semester into my music degree and thought, what am I going to do with this? Because at the time, I really didn't want to teach, and there's not a lot of performance jobs out there for oboists. So started to try to look for a different career path. My mom is a nurse, and so I was kind of naturally drawn to healthcare. So I kind of looked at nursing for a little while and then decided to go do pre-med at Carroll College in Helena. So after a year at PLU, I moved back to Montana, went to Helena for 2 years in the pre-med program, and then kind of started thinking I didn't really want to go to medical school, but still wanted to keep with healthcare. So my mom actually recommended that I look into pharmacy because I tend to be a little OCD. And my mom said that most of the pharmacists she knew were also kind of type A personalities, so recommended that I look into that. So what I did was actually spend a day with a pharmacist at St. Pete's Hospital in Helena. I didn't know anything about pharmacy at all. I had very little interactions with pharmacists throughout my whole life. Spent a day with her. She was a clinical pharmacist there, and I thought her job was super cool. So I applied to pharmacy school and took the PCAT and got in.
Wow.
So I came here just for pharmacy school.
Oh, wow. That's pretty
Mhm.
crazy. When you were in college, do you remember what kind of, was there ever a class that kind of just opened your mind or just changed your mind about like your future or that you were really just excited about?
I would say actually organic chemistry. In the pre-med program at Carroll, because I came in as a sophomore, I actually was trying to get caught up so, I could get the whole thing done within 4 years of college because PLU and Carroll are kind of expensive. So I actually ended up taking organic chemistry over the summer. So I took an entire year of OChem over the summer at Carroll. And I don't know, the professor in it was just so great and made it such a intriguing class. And we spent 3 hours in the morning in lecture and 3 hours in the afternoon in lab every day.
Wow.
And it was just, I don't know, I just loved organic chemistry for whatever reason. It was just such a fun class. And we did some super cool things in lab. And so that was one that, once I started taking that, I realized because pharmacy is so much chemistry in
Yeah.
there. That's what kind of, when my mom recommended pharmacy to me, that just seemed like that made sense.
Yeah. And organic chemistry, I think sometimes to me has flavors of like cooking to it, where you're
Totally.
like, you just put these two things together and then this is what you're going to get. And then if you add these different like, Korea, spices, you can kind of change the outcome. So,
Yes. Yeah.
um,
And
yeah.
our biochem class was kind of like that too at Carroll. We had this professor who was the most intimidating person I think I've ever met in my life, super scary guy. But the same thing, like the labs we did in there, just amazing things that we would do in the lab. And I don't know, I just felt like those two classes are kind of the ones that made me even more interested in pharmacy.
Yeah. I would also say that people tend to be kind of either biology strong or chemistry strong. So I think like those chemistry strong folks, I think they definitely kind of gravitate towards pharmacy and like you're saying it makes sense just because chemistry is such a huge backbone to pharmacy.
Mhm. It's funny because my son now is in physics, and when I took physics in college, I did terrible, and I actually took it twice because it made me so mad that I didn't get it the first time. And I thought for sure he would love chemistry. Took chemistry last year, hated it. He's in
Mhm.
physics right now, absolutely loves it. Just thinks it's the greatest class he's ever taken. So I think it's just the way we're all kind of wired.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think his interest in engineering also kind of plays off of that
Totally.
a lot.
Yes, it makes sense completely.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got you to pharmacy school. In terms of like getting into pharmacy school, that sometimes can be a competitive process or kind of a difficult hurdle for students to kind of jump. Is there any kind of advice you'd give to students in terms of ways to prepare themselves for pharmacy school?
I think one of the things that would be really helpful, I had never spent any time in a pharmacy at all, or even talked to pharmacists before I applied for pharmacy school.
Yeah.
And I think just getting out there and talking to some people, there are so many jobs that you can do in pharmacy that I don't even think we realize because I think most of us see, you go to the grocery store, you go to Albertsons and you see the pharmacy there and you see the pharmacist back there. And that's kind of the only thing that we perceive that a pharmacist does.
Yeah.
Um, which I did retail for a long time and I love it. And I've done a lot of different things in pharmacy and love them for all different reasons. But I think unless you kind of know that there's so many career opportunities out there in pharmacy, that I think we kind of go in with that kind of stereotypical picture of pharmacists where there's just so much that we can do. So I would
Yeah.
say if you can get out and even just talk to people about what they do, you don't have to go shadow them for a day. Just reach out and see if somebody can talk to you about the job that they do. So to just kind of get an idea of what's even out there would be helpful.
Yeah, and I think, well, and I hate to put you on the spot like this. Like today, I talked to a nurse who, talked about the different avenues of nursing because I think
Hmm.
again, people think of the floor nurse,
Yep.
and you're talking about like the retail pharmacist kind of being the prototypical kind of pharmacist that folks think about. Like obviously, your position is something that is not something people would think of or consider when going into pharmacy school.
Mm-mm.
But do you mind just kind of again just reaching out and giving some possible examples for other types of positions that pharmacists can fill?
Yeah. I mean, obviously there's a bunch of management positions, directors of pharmacy.
Mhm.
So if it's business that you're interested in, there's a lot of people that get a PharmD and an MBA. So you understand the pharmacy side of it, but I also understand the business side. And that's super important right now in healthcare, especially with as expensive as it is. And we're still trying to deliver quality healthcare to people, but be able to meet our budget. So I think management positions are really important for pharmacists. And so many of us graduate from pharmacy school right away, and then we're a manager. in a retail pharmacy or in a
Yeah.
hospital pharmacy. And it's not something that we have a background from in pharmacy school. So I think that that's a really interesting avenue. One of the other jobs that's kind of newer too is pharmacy informatics. And they're most of them are pharmacists, but they're the ones who help develop how electronic medical records work, help us
Mm.
build order sets, how do providers get flagged if there's a drug interaction. So those are the people that help us actually build those systems. So not only do they have to understand the pharmacy and the clinical side of it, but they also have to understand like IT and analytics. And so those people, that job right now is exploding across the entire country as
Wow.
more health systems implement these EHRs. You need somebody who understands how they work, but you also need them to have that pharmacy knowledge. So that's
Mhm.
another area that's also really interesting right now too. Um,
What does I know you've worked at St. Pat's in the hospital. Like, what is
mhm.
a hospital pharmacist? Like, how does their job kind of differ than from like a retail pharmacist?
So it kind of depends on what hospital you work at, but at St. Pat's we have satellite pharmacies are what they call. So you have the main pharmacy, typically in the basement. Most pharmacies and hospitals are, and a lot of times when you're in the main pharmacy, you're really focused on the dispensing of medications and the preparation. So you have your pharmacy technicians that typically work in the IV room and they'll prepare your compounding agents in there. And then the pharmacist is kind of responsible for overseeing, making sure that they're prepared appropriately, labeled appropriately, and make it out the door on time. Also fielding a lot of questions from nurses on the floor. And then we have satellite pharmacies. We have one on each of our floors. So we have a cardiac unit, we have oncology medical, ICU, and then there's an ortho neuro floor. And we have a pharmacist staffed on each of those units. And they're really there not only to just verify the orders from the physicians that are coming in and making sure they're appropriate for the patient, drug interactions, indications, those things, but they're also doing chart reviews to make sure that the patient's being appropriately, getting medications appropriately for their clinical issues that they're there for. And so we
Mhm.
have a bunch of different dosing protocols for things like warfarin, heparin, vancomycin, and the aminoglycosides. We actually do all the dosing for those.
Oh,
So
wow.
the physician will put an order in that'll say like warfarin per pharmacy. So then our pharmacist has to go in and look at why they're prescribing warfarin and know that, the range that they need to be in for their, the blood thinner needs to be at this particular place. So they're the ones that go in and enter the orders to monitor the blood levels. They enter the order for the warfarin itself. And then they chart all the documentation for how that particular aspect of the patient's care.
Wow.
So,
So
yeah,
that is, I think, a little bit more in-depth patient care interaction than I think people would think
yep,
of. They would think that the doctor would just know the prescription, tell the pharmacist what prescription to give them. But it sounds like there's a much more active role for the pharmacist than I think most people would assume.
yeah. And then they're kind of like the drug experts on the floor. So if the nurse has
Yeah.
a question about a medication, can I give these two together? They typically will follow up with their clinical pharmacist. And same from the physician perspective. If there's something they're trying to treat, they might go to the pharmacist to find out what's on formulary, what's best for this particular patient, what kind of side effects are we looking at. So they're really the most knowledgeable person on the floor about any of the medications.
Wow. How difficult is it to stay up on like the current medications that are being utilized in the field?
There are so many coming out now, but most people kind of specialize in a particular area.
Oh, so they
So
know.
yeah, so you kind of if like our clinical pharmacist who works in the oncology unit, she's very familiar with all of the chemotherapy agents. So if I ever have a question about that, I know that I can go to her for that. We also have
Mhm.
an antimicrobial stewardship pharmacist, AMS. And she is there. She knows all about all the different antibiotics out there. She is the one who puts together our the biogram every year. So looks at what we see for trends here in Missoula. What kind of bugs are we seeing? Are they resistant to certain antibiotics? And so she helps make sure that patients are on appropriate antibiotics for the cultures that they're seeing. So same thing, if I have any kind of questions about antibiotics, that's who I would go to. So everybody kind of has their own specialty. And I think the biggest thing is just kind of knowing who your resources are that you need to reach out to.
Hmm. Yeah, kind of depending on the specialist to give you that
Because
information.
because you can also get board certified in different areas too. So once you've graduated from pharmacy school, if you do a residency fellowship, you can also get board certified in different things. There's board certification in pharmacotherapy specialists. There's also board certification in nutrition.
Oh, wow.
So we have a pharmacist at St. Pat's who is board certified in nutrition, so can help with parenteral nutrition for patients who can't take or who can't take food orally. So she helps with that. You can also get it in critical care now and in emergency medicine.
Wow. I guess I just didn't realize that there was that level of specialization, like post graduation. Wow, that's really interesting. So I guess you quickly mentioned like kind of like after you finish pharmacy school, like what are the next steps? So you finish pharmacy school, you have to take a big test, right?
Yes. Yeah, you have to take the NAPLEX and a law exam for the state that you're living in, or the state that you're being licensed in. Each state has their own law exam. The NAPLEX is for the drug knowledge piece of being a pharmacist, and that you can take, and it covers most states. I think California still has their own and Florida has their own, but you do have to take 2 tests to get licensed as a pharmacist.
And you said that there's a law test?
Yeah, a law test for each. So like when I graduated from pharmacy school, I moved to New Jersey to do a residency, but I knew I was probably going to come back to Montana. So I took both the New Jersey law exam and the Montana law exam. So there's national laws that govern pharmacy, but then each state also has their own. So you have to know about the laws in the state where you are practicing.
Could you imagine taking the law exam in Oregon right now and just be like, nope, everything goes. This is an easy one.
Exactly.
Oh goodness. Okay, so you mentioned taking the NAPLEX, passing that's obviously important, and then you also mentioned a residency. Is a residency part of kind of the pharmacy school progression?
It can be. It depends on what you want to do. You don't have to do a residency. I think that now most positions, if you're going to be in a clinical position, they recommend that you do a residency. So residency is an additional year of training after you've graduated. So you're licensed as a pharmacist. So you actually can staff and work as a pharmacist as well, but it's just additional clinical experience. So you still have rotations in different areas. But again, you are a pharmacist, so you can verify orders, you can order things under protocol, but you're really just there to get additional training. And it can be helpful too if you don't know what you want to do. So after I graduated from pharmacy school, I wasn't sure exactly what field I wanted to go into. So I did a residency to get additional training. And where I was, we had a big nephrology population. So I did a rotation in that. We also had oncology. We had a big cancer center. So I did a rotation in oncology and one in critical care. And so you just get additional training to see if there's a field that maybe you want to specialize in. And so I think now it's becoming more common for pharmacists after they graduate to do a residency just for that additional training.
Yeah.
And then there's specialty residencies too. So at St. Pat's last year, we had a pharmacist who completed they call them PGY1. It's your first year of residency, and they typically tend to be general residencies. And then after she finished that residency, she actually went on and did a med safety PGY2 residency. So she is at Children's Hospital in Colorado, and she is just focusing for an entire year on medication safety. And they say that 1 year of residency should be comparable to about 3 to 5 years of experience as a pharmacist. So it's pretty intense training.
Gosh, that is intense. But I think it's just kind of nice to be aware of, like, once you do kind of get that pharmacy degree, like what's the next step? What can you do? What are your options? You're so informative too. I really appreciate that. So what I guess I'm going to take it back to like the big picture questions. Like, what do you love about your job?
Well, as a med safety officer, one of the things I absolutely love is trying to figure out what went wrong with a medication error. It's super helpful to have the background knowledge as a pharmacist because I know how things should go. But when I get to follow up on the med errors, you're a lot more like a private investigator, and you truly are trying to follow leads, whether it's audit trails in the chart or talking to staff that was involved with the event to try to figure out what was going on at the time when the error occurred. It's almost never just human error alone that causes those errors. There's always something in the system that we need to fix. And so trying to figure that out can be really, really challenging. But it's super rewarding when you do identify it and you get it fixed so that, you know, the next patient that comes in, that same event's not going to happen for them. So honestly, in my new role as director, I won't be doing that anymore. And that is the piece of my job that I actually am really going to miss, because I loved trying to figure out what happened and what went wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's like the investigative like part of your mind where you're just like, oh, I got to get an answer. I got to get an answer. And,
Yes.
you know, that it's easy to drive yourself forward with that.
Yeah. And sometimes it takes a lot. Some of them can take days before you figure out exactly what went wrong. So some of them can be really challenging. Some of them are really easy. You look at it, you're like, I know exactly what happened here. But some of them are really difficult, and they do actually take a lot of time to try to do the research and investigation. So that's the piece of my job I love the most.
Wow. And then in terms of just like, and you can answer for your position specifically, or kind of the pharmacy in general, like what would you say is like, not necessarily the downside, but what's kind of the more difficult component of that particular career choice?
A lot of it right now, especially with the healthcare system that we have, is there seems to be so much focus on budgetary and costs associated with healthcare. And in pharmacy, you're constantly being asked to try to keep down those costs for medications in particular, because they are super expensive and they are a huge part of a budget for a hospital.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of us are being asked to do more with less. So treat more patients that are higher acuities or sicker patients, trying to still give them the same level of care, but maybe with less staff. And sometimes that's really difficult, but it can be a good challenge too, because it does make you look at your work and think, you know, am I doing something that's really not adding any value for this patient? You know, but what can I be focusing on that can make sure that this patient gets appropriate care and we keep them safe? So it's challenging, but I think it does give a lot of opportunity to pharmacy, and a good opportunity for us too to show why we cost so much, because we are also really expensive to hospitals. So I think if you can show that our interventions also make sure that people aren't on a bunch of unneeded medications, or making sure I've dosed this medication appropriately, and so the patient's not going to get, you know, if they've got bad kidneys, I made sure that this drug was dosed appropriately so they don't have an adverse outcome. And so, you know, trying to show exactly
their health issues.
Exactly.
And I don't know if you can, because this is, again, it's kind of a big picture question, and you don't work for a pharmaceutical company, but those rising costs, like how much do you think that's associated with research and development? Like, do you think that that's where a lot you might have some insight there. Like, but you know, like people often complain about the cost of drugs, but I, you know, knowing what I know about the whole research and development, I would say that's where a larger portion of those costs come from. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I mean, there is a big chunk that goes into research and development. It's unfortunate here in the United States that we allow direct to consumer advertising. And I know I'm probably kind of biased with that, but we spend a lot of money on advertising medications here as well. And across the entire world, there's only 2 countries that allow direct to consumer advertising, and it's the US and New Zealand, and that's it.
Wow.
Nowhere else can you have commercials on television that are telling patients about all these medications, especially like now all those monoclonal antibodies. They're so expensive, but every time you watch TV, you'll see 3 or 4 different ones advertised within 1 half-hour slot. So
it's kind of crazy to think that a person's going to see a TV ad and say, you know what, I think I need that. You know, even though my doctor isn't telling me I need that, even though my pharmacist isn't prescribing it to me, I'm saying yes, yes, yes. And, you know, like, it just seems so counterintuitive to like a health, like,
yeah.
But
it happens a lot more than you think it would.
Wow. That's insane.
Yeah. So I know a lot goes into research and development, but a lot goes into advertising here. And that's, you know, it gets frustrating sometimes when you see medications that are being sold in another country for a fraction of what it costs here for a patient to access a particular medication. So sometimes that gets kind of frustrating to see. And is insurance going to cover this med, or I'm going to have to get a new prescription for this patient because their insurance has a different formulary than what the prescriber is trying to get for them. So now we have to do prior authorization with the insurance company, which as a pharmacist in the retail setting, I loved retail because I really liked the patient interaction. I do miss that from a hospital perspective because you don't interact with the patients one-on-one quite as much as you do in the retail setting. But one of the things I did not like about retail was the difficulty that insurance can add into that position.
Yeah, and that was going to kind of be my follow-up question is, and I'm not sure if you can really speak to this, but I'm going to ask you anyway, since you're part of the field, like, do you know what the costs for pharmaceuticals are like in countries that provide like socialized healthcare? Like, do you know if what does it look like in Canada for folks who are getting prescriptions? You know?
I can't speak as much to Canada as I can England, since my husband is from there. But when he first moved here, he's diabetic, and trying to get a vial of insulin here was shocking to him because in England, it's all free. So while he was here during school, he would go back to England and literally bring home an entire suitcase of insulin that would last him till the next time he went home, because there it was free because he was still under the healthcare system in England. So, but I know that there's also, a lot of downsides to that too. Like his mother needs a hip replacement. And so she just has to sit on the wait list like everybody else does. So, good and bad things. But the aspect of being able to access those medications, especially life-saving medications like insulin, because here, I think we all have seen in the media, the price of insulin, one vial of insulin can be hundreds of dollars, which for some people, that's just not even doable.
Yeah. Wow. That's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we've talked about what you like, what maybe isn't the best part. What, just, I guess if you're a student who's like a freshman or sophomore in college, you're thinking maybe pharmacy is for me. I don't really know what I want to be when I grow up. Do you have any kind of like overarching like life lessons that you would tell somebody who's, young in their career?
I would say look for any opportunity to learn something in every experience. When I was in pharmacy school and you're on rotations, there's going to be some that you don't particularly like and some that you're absolutely going to love, just like I think any experience in life. But I think everywhere you are, you can glean a piece of knowledge, whether it's, book knowledge or a life lesson. So I think that just taking the opportunity to really embrace those experiences that you get to have and learn something from every experience that you have, I think is invaluable. Especially in college, you're paying for these experiences. You want to be there. And so you want to make them worthwhile. So even if you can just take one thing away that you learn in each one of those experiences, I think that's the most important thing.
It's funny, you're the third person I've kind of had this discussion with, and ultimately this question kind of gets very similar answers. And you're talking about getting the most out of these experiences. And I think it's also just important to kind of promote, get out there and have those experiences. Like,
yes.
Put yourself out there, put yourself in uncomfortable positions. Like, there's going to be times when you are applying for an internship, or you're applying to shadow somebody, or you see somebody who you want to have a conversation with, but you're intimidated. It's just like, you have to just put yourself out there, because most often the answer is going to be yes, or I don't know, or I will help you. Very infrequently will the answer be no. And from each one of those things, you're going to take something away. But taking the chance to put yourself out there, I think, is like sometimes the hardest thing for students to do, because they're just like, oh, like, who would want to invest time in me? And the answer is most people.
Everybody. Yeah.
Yeah. Most people want to help other people
Yes.
in whatever capacity that might look like.
When I was on my fourth year of pharmacy school, when you do all your rotations, I actually signed up to do the education rotation because I was terrified of speaking in front of groups. And I knew that Jean would make me do lectures in front of the pharmacy students at the time. So that's the entire reason I took that. I never thought I'd be in academia, which actually I ended up being faculty at the pharmacy school. So it was good in the long run. But the whole reason I did it is because I used to be petrified of speaking in front of groups. So I did that rotation to totally get me out of my comfort zone.
Yeah.
And now from this perspective, I have precepted students on rotations and residents for the last 18 years. Mm-hmm. And I love working with the students because they're the next generation of our profession. So we want to make sure that they get the best experience they can, because they're the ones who are, going to be the reflection of us later on. So I love working with the students. Plus, I learn a ton from them because they're on the front lines of learning the most up-to-date information. So I learn a ton from working with them too, and fresh set of eyes. They look at something that we've done forever and ask why we do it. So I think the students also bring super valuable information for us to learn from too.
Yeah. And then they'll see at the end of the day, they'll be like, I'll show you what TikTok is.
Exactly. I've learned all sorts of things from the students I've had. So I love working with the students. I just think it's such a great experience as a pharmacist too.
Yeah. 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 Getting their perspective. It's so interesting because it's just like, oh yeah, like I used to see the world, in that way.
Yeah,
But yeah, I think that gaining the experiences and just taking everything you can away from them is just, I think, great
definitely.
advice. Um, is there anything else that you think would be worth just sharing again with future pharmacists or anything? I just want to make sure we've covered everything that you think would be relevant.
The only thing I would say is that I think that especially pharmacy, but healthcare in general, but is a very diverse field. And I think if you have something that you're interested in, I think you definitely find a place for it in pharmacy. There's so many things that we can do as pharmacists that I just don't think that everybody knows. And so I would say just get out there, ask questions, meet up with some pharmacists and pick their brains.
Yeah. I think I would also say like, pharmacy school, you'll hear how, the grades are important or what have you, but I think to the most part, like if you're willing to work hard, you can make
Yeah.
it work,
Yeah.
So don't get intimidated by necessarily like that GPA that's required. Like as long as you're willing to work hard, then it can still happen for you.
And that people skills in pharmacy are so important too, because when you do have to sit down and talk with a patient, it's just so important that you know how to interact with them. And so, any of those experiences that get you out there to talk to people who are different than you, I think is incredibly helpful for this role.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Well, and I just want to thank you so much for your time today. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording and we can continue to chat for a few minutes. But just again, I hope folks watch this and find this super valuable. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.